Hi, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on Ecocide Law for Sustainability Professionals. We've got a fantastic roster of speakers ahead of us and a really packed agenda. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. To kick off, I'm going to just first of all say thank you. Thank you to everybody who is speaking today, and thank you all of you for joining us. This is a really hot topic, but also quite a controversial one in some circles. And so it's been really, really interesting in the run up to this event to meet these incredibly passionate advocates for the Ecocide movement and those people who are really working hard to make Ecocide law a reality, not just in the UK, but all around the world. As I say, the event's been a long time in the making, and we've really got to thank our collaborators on this event today. So first of all, Stop Ecocide International, which is the movement builder and the whole background of activism, who's really brought the ecocide movement into the daylight and is working really hard to put it in front of international legislators and bring it up to the International Criminal Court. Secondly, to the Society for the Environment, who is the leading institution, the umbrella institution for environmental professionals, and those people who dole out the Chartered Environmentalist badge. So any of you listening who are CNV, you've got Society for the Environment to thank. And then last but not least, the Chartered Institute for Ecology and Environmental Management, who are the leading institution for ecologists and environmental managers in the UK and around the world. So thank you so much to those institutions for coming together to educate professionals in our sector on what Ecocide's all about. So we'll crack on with the agenda. So first, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Georgia Elliott-Smith. I'm an environmental engineer by background. I'm a chartered environmentalist and a strategic sustainability advisor in industry, and I specialise in heavy industry and hard to decarbonise sectors. So I've been working for around 25 years in environment and sustainability, and in that time have seen incredible movements. But I think that this Ecocide movement is just one of the most exciting things that I've ever come across, and I feel personally really has the power to completely change the way that we work. And so I was astonished that really not very many people in our sector were talking about it. So I hope that this event really changes that, and that we can teach you all about what Ecocide means. And you can learn from the people on this amazing roster of speakers today how you can bring it into your work. We're going to hear next from Jojo Mehta, who is the co-founder and CEO of Stop Ecocide International. She's going to give us an introduction to Ecocide, tell us all about the legal definition, which is a real thing. You'll see it on your screen on one of the shots. She's going to talk about the movement's progress around the world and its journey through to the International Criminal Court. After Jojo, we'll hear from Baroness Boycott, who is a crossbench member of the House of Lords. And thank you, Rosie, for being with us today, because obviously we've got a clash here with the King's Speech. And so Rosie chose to be with us today to talk about this incredible movement. She's going to be talking to us about a potential Ecocide Act for the UK and the Ecocide Bill that she put forward to UK Parliament back at the end of last year. Then we'll hear from Dr Ashley Buchan, who is the policy officer for CIEEM, which is Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. And she will talk about why CIEEM thinks that Ecocide is important and why it's also important to professional networks. We'll then go on to a sustainability professionals panel where I'll talk to Sam Bauer, who is head of sustainability of natural environments at Balfour Beatty, and Dougal Driver, who is chair of the board of Society for the Environment. And we're going to discuss really what sustainability professionals need to know, some of the risks, some of the opportunities, and some of the actions that we really need to take forward. Finally, we'll hear from Sue Miller, who is head of global networks at Stop Ecocide International. And she's going to give us some really strong calls to action about what we as a profession can do, how we can support the movement, and how we can continue to learn more about it going forwards. And in between all of that, we're going to be asking you to post your questions into the Q&A box. So if you can see at the bottom of your screen, there should be an option for Q&A. If you can click there and post your question, then I'll be taking a look at that throughout the event. and I'll then be able to pose those questions to our various speakers and panelists as we go along. So please be bold, ask your questions. If you see a question that you like, please vote it up as well, so that I know that the questions that are most pressing will definitely get answered. And with that, I think there's nothing left to say other than to hand over to Jojo Mehta. So Jojo is the co-founder and CEO of Stop Ecocide International. She co-founded the movement in 2017 with her friend, the barrister and legal pioneer, Polly Higgins, who is has the most incredible legacy for all of us as environmental activists. She co-founded Stop Ecocide to support the establishment of ecocide as a crime in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And now as CEO and spokesperson for Stop Ecocide, she's overseeing the remarkable growth of the movement, coordinating legal developments, diplomatic traction, and a public narrative. So Jojo, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Georgia. And thanks everybody for being here today. It's really great to be with you. We're going to be talking about this legal initiative that is currently gaining huge traction around the world. It's been described by the UN climate champions as a driver and influencer of change. It's been described by the International Corporate Governance Network, which is an investor-led network of the biggest asset management firms in the world, as a key game changer for boards of directors to be aware of. And of course, I'm referring to recognition of ecocide in criminal law. And this is the global conversation that our organisation, Stop Ecocide International, continues to foster both at diplomatic and political level and across civil society. And just a couple of months ago, the EU completed formalisation of a new, or I should probably say a revised directive, Environmental Crime Directive, so on the protection of the environment through criminal law specifically. It set out a broad range of environmental offences and created a new qualified offence that would address conduct comparable to ecocide, which is how they phrased it. This means that EU member states now have 2 years to harmonise their own penal codes with this directive. And ecocide bills have also been proposed in a number of domestic jurisdictions, from Brazil to Belgium, which earlier this year became the first country to recognise ecocide as an international level crime. And at the level of the International Criminal Court, discussions are now advancing significantly, and we could anticipate a new international crime of ecocide could very well come into play within the next 2 to 5 years, bringing that court into renewed relevance in the context of ecological and climate crisis. So this is an established and fast-moving legal direction of travel. It's one it's important to be aware of, and that is very much worth understanding, as it will likely prove essential to the support not just of sustainable economic activity, but of a safe future for humanity in the broadest possible sense. And the first thing I'd like to flag up is that talking about criminal law can be a bit triggering, as the word crime tends to send us off somewhere in our heads down a dark alley with a knife, because that's the kind of thing we associate with the word crime. We generally think of criminal law as a framework for punishment. Indeed, creating personal criminal responsibility for acts that society condemns and prosecuting perpetrators of those acts is indeed how criminal law works. But that's not what it's for. Criminal law is there to deter, prevent, and protect. So to put it simply, murder isn't a crime in order to punish murderers. It's a crime to stop people killing each other, because as a society, we consider killing each other unacceptable. It wouldn't even cross our minds to ask for a license to kill people for our next infrastructure project, for example. But we don't recoil in the same way from mass harm to nature, and it's becoming ever clearer that we should. And there are moments in history when society begins to recognise something as unacceptable and therefore worthy of prohibition in criminal law. And this is what happened with the international crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity when they were engendered in the 1940s. And we are witnessing now a moment like this with respect to destruction of the living world around us. So the vital ecosystems that make up our common home, the earth. In fact, ecocide means literally, taken from the Greek and Latin, to kill one's home. In other words, it refers to mass damage and destruction of nature, and it puts a name to something that we can all recognise is happening, just as we all recognise, I think as well, a level of frustration and even despair at the slow pace of action to address climate and ecological crisis. And the fact is that there are plenty of environmental regulations in place around the world, but they're often badly followed, woefully monitored, poorly enforced. And at the international level, Multilateral environmental agreements, targets and pledges like the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and so forth are all great, but they're all varying degrees of non-binding. And we're therefore left with a very uneven playing field, where genuine action on sustainability is a constant uphill struggle against the default flow of finance to business as usual. And we've heard directly, as in Stop Ecocide International, we've heard directly from agricultural companies, for example, that existing regulations are sometimes ignored because it's cheaper not to tick the boxes, they are struggling financially, and guess what? Nobody's checking. And a large number of corporations simply don't really know what to do in the face of a crisis of this scale. It's actually verging on unimaginable for many people. And this is where criminal law can be extremely useful, and specifically naming the very worst harms as crimes, as it really helps to reframe our understanding of our responsibility towards the living world. There is much discussion, for example, at the moment at the international level of the concept of bioeconomy. And no doubt this will mean different things to different governments and to different sectors. However, we can hopefully all agree on what it should not mean, i.e. it should not mean the destruction of those very ecosystems upon which it and we entirely depend. Now, discussion of ecocide is now on public record in at least 30 member states of the International Criminal Court, or the ICC for short. Support for establishing the crime has been logged by the Interparliamentary Union of 179 parliaments, as well as the parliamentary assemblies of the Council of Europe, which has 46 state parties, and the Organisation of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has 57 parties. And it's also been endorsed by figures as eminent as the UN Secretary General, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Pope, and more. So, what precisely do we mean by ecocide? There have been various definitions developed over the years since the term was first coined in 1970, when it was used to refer to the damage created by Agent Orange in the Vietnam War. However, recently, in 2020, our charitable foundation was approached by Swedish parliamentarians asking if we could commission a draft text that would be concise, effective, and politically practical, that they could actually ask their government to propose at the International Criminal Court. And on the basis of that request, we were able to convene a remarkable independent expert panel of 12 top lawyers from around the world with various legal specialisms and ideological standpoints. And following a broad public consultation and 6 months of deliberations, the panel emerged in June 2021 with a consensus definition. And the definition runs as follows, and I think it should be popping up on your screen right now. There it is. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, this definition has gained huge political traction. Indeed, it has catalysed the many political developments and legal discussions that have emerged in the 3 years since. And it's a very powerful and also very balanced definition, creating foundational reinforcement for existing laws. It doesn't create a new crime out of nowhere, but it adds a level of responsibility for those in breach of existing laws, regulations, and rights frameworks. Regulatory obligations will be taken far more seriously in the knowledge that failing to fulfill them and threatening ecocide as a result could mean criminal responsibility for key decision makers. And this is a major step for accountability, and it will change decision-making in a very positive way. So it will be a major playing field leveler, better preventing irresponsible and reckless conduct and helping those leaders in the sustainability arena to be able to move into the lead in the market as well. And linked to this is the change in attitude provoked by the fact that this crime focuses on consequences. So on the result or the threatened result of the act, rather than on a list of prohibited acts. So instead of trying to ensure that a company's activities avoid certain categories, it will require really a kind of reality check with respect to what is happening on the ground and with assessments based on the best available and local and scientific knowledge. And that is likely to provoke some very specific questions, for example, about supply chains, operational issues, and those will vary from sector to sector, of course, and even from company to company. But they may well be questions that have not been asked before and should be, and are also likely to lead to new approaches, connections, and solutions. And as a former entrepreneur myself, I'm well aware that the best stimulus to innovation and creativity is actually a good set of parameters. It's unreasonable to expect policymakers to know what each economic sector should do to become sustainable. It makes a lot more sense to give the experts within those sectors the framework they need to work it out. And this likely consequence-based approach not only encourages use of the precautionary principle, but is also super important precisely because it doesn't target any specific industry. By instead referring to the severity of actual or threatened harm, the definition therefore remains dynamic over time, as well as intuitively understandable. And it also helps that the core of the definition fits on the back of a business card, which is super handy when you're dealing with busy politicians. And interestingly, lawyers and politicians often focus on what will happen when the law is in place, who will be prosecuted, how, and so forth. By contrast, it is often those in the corporate world and indeed the investment world who truly understand that the game-changing power of this law doesn't kick in at adoption. It kicks in now with us when we hear about it. Because the time between now and the adoption of the law, which at the current rate we predict will likely be within 3 to 5 years and certainly before 2030, is the window for strategic positive change. And of course, in European countries, that time is actually going to be fairly soon, within the next 2 to 3 years. And businesses already on that path will therefore find themselves ahead of the game. And investors and insurers can start assessing now where the safest places are to put their money and what to avoid underwriting. And of course, I mean safest financially and legally, but I also mean safest in the real world, which is to say least likely to destroy the ecosystems upon which we wholly depend. And let's not lose sight of that, because this is a real world solution to a real world problem. And Ecocide law compliant will likely also mean climate safe and nature safe. And in the last 5 years, this initiative has moved way faster than we expected, and it's accelerating all the time. So what you'll be hearing today is both a useful heads up and a call to creativity. It may even be a relief for decision makers to be obliged to abide by rules that have common sense, integrity, and the support of life embedded in them. To be able to say to boards of directors and shareholders that healthier approaches must be taken because activities that could threaten severe harm will become criminal. And finally, and I'll just end with this, this law will be important to the young, to future generations, which also, of course, means the future workforce, for very obvious reasons. It will protect the world they're growing up into, the work they will do in it, and it will provide the legal safety rail that they are and will increasingly and rightly demand, and which we all need. So as I hope I've made clear, Ecocide law is an eminently logical, necessary and positive way to help steer investment and policy making in a positive direction, both for us and for the planet. Because after all, criminal law is not about the prosecutions and the punishment, it's about deterring dangerous behaviour and protecting life, something I think we can all agree is worth doing. Thank you very much.
Jojo, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And as always, when I hear you talk, I have so many questions. So I hope that we've had a couple of questions pop up in the Q&A box, but please, everybody who is listening, feel free to just put all of your questions in there. If you're thinking it, I'm sure that so many other people are thinking it too. What really resonated for me was where you started off with, it's cheaper to pollute, and frankly, nobody's checking. You know, as a sustainability professional in industry, you know, that really makes my skin crawl, but I know it to be true. You know, we all know that this is true. And so it's such an interesting position that we find ourselves in. I'm going to leave the questions until we've heard from a couple more speakers. And I think in particular, it's great to hear you talk about, you know, introducing this concept of from now till 2030 is our strategic window. This is our opportunity to introduce those policies that are going to drive the future of our companies, you know, and I think that is so urgent and important that we can't just sit on our laurels until 2030. This is now the window for opportunity and for action. And if we're, as businesses, going to not only mitigate risk, but also capitalize on those opportunities that we can see ahead of us, now is the time to really get involved in this. So thanks, Jojo. I'm now going to hand over to Baroness Rosie Boycott. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for making us a priority over the King's Speech. That's we're very, very flattered. Thank you. So to introduce Rosie, she is a pioneering journalist, author and publisher. She was the first woman in history to edit a broadsheet newspaper in 1996. and so is a real change maker and pioneer. She became a crossbench member of the House of Lords in 2018, where she advocates for sustainable food policy and also for climate action. She leads the London Food Strategy, and in November 2018, she introduced an Ecocide Bill to the House of Lords. So, Rosie, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Georgia, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and hello to all the other panelists. And Jojo, that was fantastic as ever to see you and hear you speak. And as Georgia pointed out, and as in fact we've just shut the window because there's a terrific amount of bell ringing and general hoopla going on outside the window, and we've been watching horses and carriages truck past and indeed get the initial outline of the King's speech. Went downstairs to pick up the fuller one. There's not a huge amount of environmental stuff. It's primarily about energy. There's not much about food, but we'll have to look harder. Let me just tell you what the process is. I have an Ecocide bill as a private member's bill, which is in the ballot. So the ballot is a quite extraordinary idea, but it's, I suppose, fair. People put in bills, you put them in, you have to put them in by this morning, or actually tomorrow morning, I think, and then they get pulled out tomorrow night. And if your number is 20 or under, then you have a good shot of getting your bill onto the floor of the House into a second reading debate. If you're further down the line, then it gets a lot dodgier because there's lots of other business that gets in the way and slightly squeezes the private members' bills. In the last session, I in fact came out number 16 with my Ecocide bill, and had there not been an election called when it was called, I would have got the second reading debate sometime, maybe this week, in fact. So while I'm incredibly pleased we've had a change of government, I'm also miffed that the bill failed to register, because while I don't think it will get passed immediately, I think it will in due course. But the great thing, of course, about being able to have a parliamentary debate is you can drum up a lot of publicity and you can start to flush out some of the objections, which, especially after I listened to Jojo and the more I think about it, and I've thought about it a lot, I find it very hard to find really good objections to this bill. I can see that there's lots of problems about how you do it, and there might be lots of bits of wriggle room around the edges, but that we need it is just, it's just impossible to think of not having it. When you think of whether it's a question of what's happening to our water, what's happening to with chicken farms in the Wye, or whatever it is, these are crimes that are causing us, and as Jojo ended up saying, it's the future generations that are going to pay these staggering prices. And it's 2024, and by 2030, we need to be looking at another world. So let me tell you a bit about what is in the bill. We've spent a lot of time talking to a lot of lawyers, including all Jojo's partners and people who work with her, about trying to our definition of ecocide as it applies to the individual, quotes, unlawful acts committed by persons who had knowledge or should have had knowledge that there was a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by these acts. I think that's pretty straightforward. And as it applies to a company, an organization, a partnership, or other legal entity, which we collectively referred to then as the organization, unlawful acts committed by persons who represent the directing mind and the will of the organization, and who had knowledge or should have had knowledge that there was substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment. So this is about being able to get to the people at the top. And I think we all know that an ecocide law that just would penalize the poor bloke who turned off the stopcock at the sewage works as such at the wrong time. Yes, we could throw the book at him, but that is actually not what it's about. We have to be throwing the book at someone much, much higher up the chain, as indeed we don't do in finance and corruption and all these things, but we have to do it here. This act would require the government to establish penalties for the offences. It would protect people who whistleblow on environmental offences or who collaborate with investigations, and it would apply to everyone. So that means public bodies, i.e. the government or Ofwat or whoever it happens to be, and government departments and agents of the crime. So what does this mean in reality? So we've already got planning protections, which can result in certain kinds of, offences, including prison time. For instance, cutting down trees, destroying certain kinds of habitats. Those are at the moment within regulations. But this bill would introduce a high level for severe or widespread or long-term damage to the environment. It wouldn't be about chopping down a single tree or about emptying one bucket of poo into a river. It has to go much further than that. On the one hand, it can increase the penalty for already illegal acts. For instance, as water companies illegally discharging sewage, which they have been fined vast sums of money for doing. And it would mean that the individuals responsible can't hide behind the corporate structure of the organizations they were making decisions on behalf of. So I don't know who remembers the boss of Southern Water, who faced a case about discharge of sewage on beaches around the Hastings area. And he said in court, he was fined 90 million, his company. And the judge said, this is kind of crazy. This is an insane amount of money. And he said it was cheaper to pay the fine than to fix the sewage system. And if that had been a criminal offence, which is what this would do, I think you'd have got a really different answer. I think it would really send the right kind of message that you can't do this. And it doesn't hurt someone to have to spend someone else's money paying their way out of trouble. But what is important, I think, about this, and Jojo also said this, and so I'm somewhat repeating what she says, it's about how we'll be able to look at the regulations in the future. So a lot of things that I think, and Jojo, I'm sure agrees with me, that are, so to speak, legal, should not be legal. So lots of current rules, lots of regulations, and lots of licensing conditions can happen, and the individual or the company that are carrying them out can act with impunity within the framework of the law. So while although an individual could never be guilty of ecocide if they're acting in the terms of their license, say in terms of farming or in terms of fisheries, for instance, bottom trawling inside an MPA, which is completely mad, but is indeed licensed and permitted in some MPAs. If the license grantor was found to have knowledge or should have had knowledge that there was a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment, then they could be found guilty of ecocide. So what this bill would do, apart from going for individuals, is hopefully, and I think it would, is help straighten up some of these extremely pathetic regulations, many of whom have been set or agreed on by vested interests. I mean, much of the work that I do is around the food industry, and you look at the lobbying power and then the result of the weak regulation, and the same things apply across, say, a lot of the fishing industry. So if a public authority, for instance, had granted a fishing license, which they knew would cause damage, then that public authority would be in the wrong. Or if an industrial farmer was killing off a river from runoff from the farm, but was operating again within the terms of their license, the grantor of the license would be guilty. Ultimately, as with all criminal law, this would be initially decided in the courts. But again, as Jojo says, we don't want to end up endlessly wading through courts, law after law after law. We want to establish a criminal level that people know, that people understand, in exactly the same way that if you cause a car accident or you do lots of things that we all accept within the law, you will be guilty. So that its effect will run right through the system, from what the individual action is, through to what the corporate action is, through to what the government action is, and indeed the action of a lot of government agencies. We want jail time to be on the cards. This is very, very important, that at some point someone is seen to pay the price with their hands behind their back, shuffling into some miserable prison. The aim is to create a really serious deterrent and to completely alter the way that individuals respond to corporate responsibility. This bill, it's important, my bill, only applies to England. if we get through to the next stage, I definitely would hope that we can get contributions from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland to start supporting it. But right now, this is an English situation, and I hope that if, whatever work we can do here can go towards helping other countries to move forward, because we've certainly been able to take a lot of encouragement from the fact that these bills are in different stages through going through the laws in the EU and indeed in other countries. I sometimes think that if it was in the Statutes of Rome and internationally understood, that in certain ways we would all agree that someone like Bolsonaro would have been guilty under international court for what he did to the Amazon, to the rainforest. Sometimes that's easier to see than some of the domestic ones, but the domestic one is very, very important. So I keep my fingers crossed. I will let you know on Friday via Georgia what number we've got and whether we're on for a proper debate and a proper chance to shove this up the agenda. But there's a lot of people here who approve of this and want to see this happen. So even if I fail, there'll be other routes that we can all follow. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Rosie. That's very, very interesting. And thank you for your leadership on this. I think, this is really taking an activist movement and turning it right into national policy and regulation. So thank you. Your point on lobbying, I find very, very interesting. I was speaking at an event last night about lobbying. 89% of corporate lobbying is aimed at delaying or blocking positive climate and ecological regulation. And so we desperately need a larger opposing force against that, that will actually help us move policy and regulation into a place where we're all pushing towards a better world. And anybody really who is interested in sustainability and, is interested in genuinely pushing forward climate and ecological progress really needs to start getting vocal and start having brave conversations about systems change rather than just focusing on our own small companies or our own, what's right in front of us. Rosie, you did have a couple of technical problems there. So if you don't mind just working on that but before we have the questions, then I'm sure you'll come back fine. So next, I'm going to pass on to Dr. Ashley Buchan. Ashley is Policy Officer at CIEEM, the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. CIEEM is the leading professional body for ecologists and environment managers in the UK and abroad. Ashley, as policy officer, is an influential voice for the sector, advising governments on policy and practice in relation to management of the natural environment. And Ashley is going to talk to us now about CIEEM's position on Ecocide and really what this means for your members and then for the wider community of environmental professionals. So thank you, Ashley, over to you.
Thank you, Georgia. So I'm going to share a presentation, but I promise I don't intend this to be death by PowerPoint. So yes, my name's Ashley Buchan. I'm Policy Officer and I focus my attention on the devolved nations, so Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but also the Republic of Ireland. Okay, so here is an outline of what I'm going to speak to you about today. I have 10 minutes, so it's going to be a whiz through. I'll start by saying I'm not an expert in ecocide, but that I welcome the opportunity. Oh, pardon. I welcome the opportunity to think about this in the context of CIEEM and its members. So what I've done is I've framed my presentation around 3 questions which some CIEEM members might have. Before we had this event today, we got together and we spoke about how ecocide perhaps isn't as well known among professional environmental experts as it should be. I thought a little bit about why this might be, but also what questions might come up when our members are thinking about this. So I framed it around, will Ecocide Law present greater legal risk to me? I hope I'm not anticipating what Dougal's going to talk about later, but my intention with that question is I hope to provide some reassurance to our members and any other professional environmental professionals out there. Also, will my environmental expertise be in greater demand? Will there be better whistleblower protections? And finally, I'll look at some next steps for CIEEM with regards to Ecocide. So CIEEM's experience of Ecocide law to date has been relatively limited. We're still quite new to the topic. Most of our involvement has surrounded Monica Lennon's public consultation on her proposed Ecocide Members' Bill in the Scottish Parliament. So we reviewed and signed up to Scottish Environment Link's response to that. And I also want to highlight the Environmental Rights Centre Scotland's work on the topic of ecocide. I particularly found their report on scoping a domestic legal framework for ecocide in Scotland very helpful in thinking about ecocide and its relevance to us as a sector. So moving on to, will ecocide law present greater legal risk to me? So CIEEM doesn't have a Hippocratic oath, but what we do have is a code of professional conduct, which all members of CIEEM are required to sign up to as part of their contract of membership. So I draw attention to two particular points. One is regards upholding the reputation of the profession and not bringing it into disrepute and protecting the public interest. And another concerns complying with all relevant laws, exercising professional judgment, applying objectivity, etc. So there are already laws that criminalise environmental harm, and having an ecocide law will not change that. But one thing to draw attention to, because this is a two-way street, is if you're going to follow the law, it's necessary that the law be clear, that you know exactly what crimes are included in this. And so I refer to legality, the requirement that crimes are specific and detailed enough for a person to understand what conduct is prohibited. And that will likely, from what I've observed, vary from country to country and exactly what form of bill, what form of ecocide law is presented in a bill. So it's largely up to the legislator. But what can help with this, what can certainly help CIEEM and help our members, is some clear guidance accompanying any ecocide law. So that guidance might contain a list of specific prohibited acts, which is potentially limiting, but it may also, as there are plenty of examples of, include a definition of ecocide or a more formulaic approach, and perhaps a combination of these could be helpful. But another thing that's helpful, and I know Baroness Boycott referred to, is ecocide law should be focused at those at the top, avoiding inappropriate criminalisation of workers, e.g. superior responsibility. So often our members are only going to be in a position to advise, but ecocide usually specifically concerns wanton acts of harm. And so it's those that are responsible for that decision-making in the knowledge of likely or possible harm that arguably should be the targets of ecocide law. So I'll move on then to, will my environmental expertise be in greater demand? So CIEEM members' expertise will be particularly invaluable to the development and updating of any guidance that might come out with law, certainly on advising on compliance, and also assessing compliance, as well as providing expert witnesses for what are likely to be quite complex cases, should they get to court, but also on advising environmental restorative methods in the event that fines perhaps aren't the most desirable outcome of successful prosecution of ecocide. It may be that communities benefit more from restoration of that harm or correction of that harm. But I also want to draw attention to a big issue in the sector, and that is a current issue of a lack of resourcing for and capacity within the UK environmental enforcement. That means existing regulations aren't currently successfully being applied. This extends to the ability to investigate and enforce existing environmental laws, but also monitoring and surveillance capabilities, which are essential to detecting and preventing environmental harms. So for any new offence to be effective, this issue really needs to be addressed. And then, will there be any whistleblower protections? So CIEEM members may not necessarily commit acts of environmental harms themselves, but they may be witness to them. In the UK, generally speaking, it doesn't pay to be a whistleblower. Often it has highly adverse effects on career and livelihoods. Also in recent years, protesters' protections have been eroded. So I'd like to highlight this recommendation of the ERCS's report, which is it might be useful to accompany an Ecocide law with enhanced protections for whistleblowers, and that these are important in their own right, whether we have an Ecocide bill or not. So in conclusion, I believe that Ecocide law potentially has many opportunities for ecologists, environmental managers. As an organisation, we'll certainly be following developments in every country and internationally. We'll continue to advocate for Ecocide law that works for our members. We will, as necessary, prepare jurisdiction-specific guidance for members to help you understand exactly what Ecocide law means. We will also continue to liaise with environmental law professionals, including ERCS, and we will encourage joined-up approach to Ecocide across borders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley. That's fantastic. If I could ask you to just stop sharing your screen. Wonderful. Thank you. Very, very interesting. And I think raises an important question. Ashley, since you've just spoken, I think I'll bring one to you that's come from the Q&A. What do you believe is the responsibility then of the professional institutions and bodies to oversee whether their members are aware of these issues, like Ecocide coming up, and to what extent they're being included in their professional activities?
So, yes, I think that for our organisation, as I say in the last slide, it's important for us to follow exactly what Ecocide law will look like and ensure that it is going to be workable for our members, that we can actually apply it. This does extend to continuing to advocate for better funding for regulatory agencies and the expertise that's required to not only enforce but try and prevent acts of ecocide. With good laws, with good guidance, we can make sure that those are communicated to our members so that they're clear on what is required of them to ensure that acts of ecocide are prevented, as well as adequately prosecuted in the worst case scenario.
Right. Thank you. And I think when we come onto the panel, we'll talk a bit more about professional institutions and the way that we apply this to our work. Jojo, I just wanted to come to you next. There has been a question in the box, and it is a question that came up for me when I first learned about Ecocide. We as environmental professionals and just generally are really weighed down by myriad environmental regulations that seem to change on a daily basis, and it's really a very, very confusing landscape. How is this any different from what we already have? And will it simply cause more confusion and be lost in the whole forest, hopefully a standing forest, not a degraded forest, of existing environmental regulation? Where does this fit?
So this fits really, as you kind of need to imagine yourself sort of panning out a bit, I think, and looking at sort of the biggest picture, and actually looking at perhaps there's something actually terribly simple about this, in a way that is very different from most environmental regulation. I mean, the majority of environmental regulation is often very, very precise. You know, there's a lot of specific do's and don'ts. There's a lot of, you can use this much of this thing in this context, and you know, and it's completely understandable that it becomes sort of burdensome, if you like. And there's sort of two aspects to Ecocide law that are different to that. I mean, one, of course, you're talking about a criminal law, so it's not so much of a tick box exercise. It's more something that actually has to be taken. I suppose one way of looking at it is almost like a criminal version of a health and safety law. I mean, you don't build a factory in such a way that it almost breaks people's heads open all the time, you know, which is actually how a lot of environmental regulation is treated. You actually do it so that nobody's going to break their head open. So you're looking at avoiding a hazard rather than sort of mitigating a different levels of risk. So there's that sort of different aspect with criminal law, and also, of course, because it becomes one of those kind of baselines, you know, just like, you know, you don't ask for a license to kill people, you also don't massively destroy the environment. And the second aspect is simply that because of this sort of simple, you know, you need to, what needs to be avoided is severe and either widespread or long-term harm. That's a very, very simple filter to apply to absolutely everything we do. And actually, it's very, very common sense. We should already be applying it. In fact, one of the responses we often get is, well, oh, isn't this a crime already? I would have thought it would be, because there's something so sort of intuitively obvious about it. So it does sort of sit in a slightly different perspective, I think, to all of that regulatory activity.
Yeah, I think that. Thank you very much. I think that's very interesting, and I think as well, there's an important question here, which is about burden of proof. Because again, when I think about this, when I talk to other professionals about it, they're very concerned about what does burden of proof look like? How do you define significant? And Rosie, also, this is one for you to address too. Perhaps you could answer that in building your Ecocide Bill, what are you thinking when it comes to evidence and burdens of proof?
Well, I think that's a very crucial question, and you have to go back to, if we took the regulations, for instance, around the water companies at the moment, who are only allowed to discharge sewage in extreme rain conditions, you could make a case for the fact that we're getting a lot more extreme rain conditions, therefore the regulations need to be rewritten. But also we know, because there's evidence that has been collected both by whistleblowers and to some degree by the Environment Agency, which is understaffed, etc., that in fact the systems are old and antiquated and have not been invested in terms of the infrastructure. So therefore they get turned on to allow sewage to go into rivers at times that break the regulations. So since in a case like that, your burden of proof is fairly simple. You have a combination of busting through a regulation, and you have a combination also of a regulation not being strict enough. Obviously, it's quite difficult when you come to something like water runoff on a field, going into a river, causing oxygenation, causing death of fish. And it's like if you've got some pigs, possibly it's all right. If you're trying to rear 1,000 pigs, it may be a completely different story. So I think that there will still be problems. And in weird ways, sometimes this is where the domestic bit gets very tricky, that you do have to establish a certain number of baselines. I mean, again, you could look at the River Wye right now and say, this is clearly a case of ecocide of a river, and we know what to do. But you have to, as Jojo says, what you want is a sense of reform all the way through the structure, so that we kind of catch this before it happens. I mean, it's a bit like saying with the bicyclist, if an electric bike goes down the pavement at 30 miles an hour, they're probably going to hit someone, which actually nearly happened to me the other night when I was walking the dog. So therefore, the electric bike shouldn't be on the pavement in the first place. So you have to get thinking into the way that we structure stuff. Don't do it in the first place before it becomes a really big problem. But I think that's difficult, and I think that companies will work very hard. As we know, again, I talk about food, everything is about fudging issues, making it unclear, saying we need more evidence, we've got to show that for another review, blah, 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 blah. And that's another thing we have to keep fighting all through this.
Thank you. Jojo, we've got an incredible international audience here of people really from very far-flung places. We're currently talking about situations in the UK, like the River Wye, which is a really hot topic for us here. Large animal agriculture has been found to be polluting a river here in the UK, which is the case that's been talked about. And that's very, very topical for us right now. But for those internationally, we're seeing, in the comments, in the chat, in the questions, people from countries saying, what can we do? We're not a member of the EU, or, our country, we can see that ecocide is happening here. So can you just touch on, what is progress like internationally? What's going on in individual countries, and how can people in their own nations bring this forwards and have some momentum to try and put this, into the daylight in their countries?
Fabulous question. There's actually I mean, the conversation is very much growing worldwide. It's not just in Europe. We have there's a lot of interest in Africa. There's a lot of interest in Latin America and various countries. There are proposals of law going into parliaments in different countries. What we would probably say first and foremost is, by all means, get in touch with us to find out whether there, what is already potentially going on in your country, and we can. I mean, I expect Robin could pop the team at Ecocide, stopecocide.earth in the chat as a contact email for that. I mean, just as a practical way of sort of inquiring where things are at. And what we're seeing is that there is a kind of coherence emerging where bills are being proposed and where conversations are moving forward. They're often very much aligned with the proposed international definition, which has sort of triggered all of this conversation. And so there, any ways of sort of raising awareness or making connections at policy level around what is happening globally, because we are definitely, this is not a question of is or is this not going to happen. It's clearly already happening in more and more places. So it's potentially a question of bringing your own policymakers into the picture, and we're more than happy to help to arrange briefings and so on to actually bring people up to speed, because that's very much, I think, where we're at with this. It's a question of it's been moving much faster than we anticipated. And so what we're really keen to do, as I think this is really a key point of today's event, is to bring people up to speed with how this is moving forward, so that there's that everybody can kind of get their heads round addressing this. But certainly, and this speaks to the lobbying issue that was being mentioned earlier, there's nothing more powerful than a conversation. It's actually hugely important that this topic is raised in many different areas, not just policy, but also across kind of cultural, the private sector, the faith sector, academic sector, all of these different sectors, because that is actually what helps to move this forward at the legal level. No politician wants to be the first person at a party. It's not safe. So the more people are talking about it, the safer it gets.
Absolutely. There is definitely a cultural element to this. And I think that this is where the sustainability profession has a real important moral imperative here to really talk about this, to talk about it amongst their colleagues, to bring the issue to their professional institutions. And we're going to come on to this in the panel. I've had a hell of a job trying to get people in industry to talk about ecocide. It seems to be a really difficult topic for people to discuss, and feel safe discussing it. We don't want that to be the case. We want this to come out. I think you speak to anybody, they would agree on a personal level that ecocide is something which naturally should already be banned. Why is it that this is allowed to happen? And so we just need to normalize that conversation, I think. I think just finally, to close off this question session before we go to the panel, I've got one last question for you, Ashley, that might be in your wheelhouse. There was a question about putting regulatory bodies under even more pressure. We've got a situation here in the UK where we know that our Environment Agency has suffered from many, many years of lack of funding, ever increasing burden of workload. And so they really are stretched when it comes to investigating and prosecuting environmental offences. Do you see that potentially Ecocide might increase the risk of a reluctance to issue permits or a reluctance to investigate, where potentially that adds to a burden? Or do you think there's any other risk here where we could potentially be introducing something which is not policeable?
That's a really interesting question, especially the specifics about licenses and whether they're less likely to be issued. And that's certainly something that I'll take back to my colleagues to discuss. But yes, my concern is that since existing environmental regulations and laws, it's difficult to enforce them anyway right now. And that's at least in part why we have so many issues as we do with waterways, for example. We could do a lot more with what we have if we had more resources available in greater capacity in that sector. So with an Ecocide Bill, there are many benefits to it. One might hope that as it gains traction, it will also draw attention to that serious underfunding and under-resourcing of environmental regulation. I hope that that would go hand in hand. But it's definitely an issue to bear in mind that if Ecocide law is to work well, then we need to have the people and the tools to monitor it, survey it, and to report on it.
Great, thank you very much. I know I said I was going to draw the questions to an end, but one's just come in that is close to my heart. So, you know, chair's privilege. I'm gonna ask it. Rosie, this is for you. In terms of targeting ecocide law at the top of organisations, do you think that there's benefit in amending the Companies Act? So this is part of, you know, it's aligned with the Better Business Act about changing the fiduciary duty of company directors so that they not only look at financial benefit and stability of the organisation, but they also look at their environmental and social impact. So what do you see as being the crossover here? And are you working with colleagues on that issue?
Thank you for the question. It's a very good one, and without a doubt, you would want to see this written into contracts. It comes back to, you know, the bicycle on the road, so to speak. I mean, it should be an automatic thing. It's not, and if it needs to get written into contracts, then it should. I think Jojo said it's like dealing with a new health and safety. It's not that it's new, but a health and safety decision. I mean, you would be prosecuted as a boss if you know, your factory burns down due to faulty wiring and a whole bunch of workers get killed. I mean, we should give the same kind of protections to the environment. And if it needs to get written in, it needs to get written in. I do not know enough about company law to know whether this has to happen, but I would be actually very interested in hearing, I mean, from the person who maybe asked the question, exactly how you think that would work. Because if it's something you think is important and should go in, then let's open a dialogue about it, because, you know, we're framing this as we go along, and when we hit hurdles or new ideas, we want to be able to either incorporate them or figure out, have we done enough to cover them? So thank you for it.
Lovely, thank you very much. Right then, without any further ado, I will move on to the panel. So I'd like to introduce our panelists joining us today. So Sam Bauer is Head of Sustainability Natural Environment at Balfour Beatty. He's a chartered environmentalist with over 25 years of experience in nature conservation, working on long-term strategic and technical development to realise a more nature-compatible construction sector. Gosh, sounds fabulous. He's also a technical authority on blue-green infrastructure, biodiversity net gain, and ecological protection on high-profile infrastructure projects. And he sits on several practitioner working groups with the aim of progressing industry standards. So thank you for joining us, Sam. And then also Dougal Driver. He's a forester and a chartered environmentalist. He's the chair of the board of the Society for the Environment, which has registered around 10,000 environmental professionals around the world. He's chairman of judges for SOCEN's Environmental Professional and Rising Star Awards. Dougal's also the founder and CEO of Grown in Britain, a not-for-profit organisation that runs research and development for innovative timber products and sets certification standards, for UK's trees, woods and forests. So thank you both of you for joining us. And I'd like to start out with maybe quite a provocative question. I've had a heck of a job, as I mentioned earlier, trying to get industry professionals to speak about Ecocide. And as you know, in our pre-event conversations, I've spoken to a huge number of prominent sustainability professionals and not so prominent ones as well in industry to ask them whether they would be willing to speak on a panel about Ecocide. And I have had dozens of no's, that this has been too controversial, too topical, or I've had people say yes, and then their marketing and communications team has said, oh no, we don't think that's something that we can talk about publicly. I'd like your reflections on that, because I think that that's quite an interesting place to start in terms of why are people not talking about Ecocide? So perhaps Dougal, I'll start with you, because I know that you've got quite interesting opinions on this.
Yeah, hello everybody. I can understand an initial reaction that you've got there from people because of the language. I'm less understanding when you lift the lid on it and just learn a little bit more about it, as people are doing today, perhaps for the first time, and realizing that actually there's nothing more mainstream than what we've been talking about today. How can there be anything more mainstream for anybody involved in the environmental world, whether they're professionally qualified or not, than this? But particularly if you are recognized by an institution or want to be recognized for your professionalism, that you can't see this as absolutely core to your profession and your work. I wonder whether if we had this conversation in a couple of years' time, whether you'd get that same reaction, Georgia. I hope you might not. I have a view that we might be at this very sensible point in a journey where pragmatism starts to take the place of activism, and that the journey of the activists who are on your screen today, absolute heroes and heroines, to get to this point where it's clearly a practical way forward, and the activists have to do that awful thing about letting go a little bit of the activism because it becomes practically embedded. And it's organisations like SOCEMV and the 20 or so institutions that we're an umbrella body for, and the 8,500 registrants that we have across the world, start to practically embed it into their daily lives. And I'd like to think you might get a different reaction in a few years' time as that journey starts to switch.
I think I agree with that. I think that there is that difficult transition going from activist-led movement through to absorption and assimilation with professional standards and professional institutions and ways of working. And that, I think we're right on that interface now. Sam, do you have any reflections on that?
I think it might be partly that there is a lack of awareness. And as Dougal said, the term ecocide is quite a shocking expression. I think maybe there's uncertainty around what it actually means and the implications of it. And so I think potentially that a reluctance to speak is because there's just this uncertainty about what they may be getting into and the implications on their job and their business from appearing to advocate for this very bold term might mean for them and their business. So I mean, I've been following Ecocide for many years, so I like to think I've been interested in watching it for a long time, so I wasn't threatened in that way.
And massive kudos to you from a construction company, which actually, there are issues with some industries that are going to be difficult and thorny for us to work through. And I think construction is one of those industries. It is the very interface between industry and nature. And so, it's fantastic that you're here to speak to us and that you're able to talk about these issues and that you're able to talk about those inside your business as well. What do you think about Ecocide when you look at how Ecocide, if it were to come into law into the UK, how might that change your client base or change your project types? What do you foresee this might do for a business like yours?
So, I mean, the construction sector has been evolving, well, since inception, and a change in regulation. We're used to changes in regulation. We're used to having to adapt and modify our business models and our way of practice and the kind of projects that come into our portfolio and remit. So in a way, I don't think it's necessarily going to be that big a change. Particularly my business, we do, on the whole, large infrastructure projects. The need for large infrastructure is not going to disappear. There's still going to need to be places for people to live and for power to be generated and for goods to be moved around the country and so forth. What is likely to change may be how we go about doing that, possibly where we go about doing it, and basically our clients' aspirations and requirements reflecting societal change and obviously changing regulations. So that component of our business, I don't see as it being a seismic change, just a realignment with a new set of requirements, really.
Okay, yeah, I think there is something different here, though, isn't it? I mean, we've been no stranger for some time in construction around criminality when it comes to environmental impact. But I think this is something slightly different, isn't it? And I think there is an issue here down through supply chains, because although our companies may not themselves be engaged in potentially ecocidal activity, do you think, and this is to you also, Dougal, this issue of when we look at carbon emissions, by far the largest for most businesses is their scope 3 emissions. So the stuff that's, inherent in the stuff that they're buying. How does that make you feel about looking down through supply chains? Because we know that we're going to be buying products from industries, the mining industries, extractive industries, and Dougal, for you as a forester, potential forestry products and these sorts of things. So how do you think that this then impacts us as professionals looking down through supply chains, and how far down those supply chains do you think that we should be going? Either of you jump in.
Well, I'll jump in on, because you mentioned my name, but I'm very interested to hear what Sam's got to say about his supply chains. But that's the reason why I founded a certification body to do that, to make sure that people had choices and understood about sustainable legal. And in our case, we do the UK provenance on that for a certification as well. I think there's a relationship here between, as you started to get to scope 3, by definition, you're getting further away from the source in sort of general terms. And I think this is where actually the term ecocide, as described as shocking, is very useful, because I think it enables you to have a conversation with supply chains, which turn a conversation with somebody who might only have to make a small difference, and therefore feels they don't have to make that difference because it's not either important to that client. They won't lose necessarily the business overnight if they don't change. If you can start introducing some quite strong, hefty language around small pieces of the jigsaw puzzle being put together to create something that might look like something like Ecocide, it does change the tenor of that conversation. I think it allows those of us who are advocates and trying to inspire people to change, that you can link to something that has a bigger impact. There was when people were asked to change the way they use cotton buds or single-use plastics, people always felt that they were a tiny influencer and couldn't make a difference. I think this subject and this language allows people to feel like they are actually part of that. I noticed, sorry to cut across perhaps your job, Georgia, a little bit, I noticed somebody commenting in the chat around the impact of the power of the buyer, the power of the procurer, the person on the street. And I link that to the supply chain story, which is always quite a sophisticated discussion, usually on quite narrow things. But if you can bring that bigger picture stuff into it, I think that's very powerful. Sam, you're ingrained in supply chains, and I'd be interested in hearing Sam answer your question as well, Georgia.
Yeah.
I think this is where, certainly from my side of the industry, this is where the biggest potential impacts from this legislation, if it were to come to pass, would resonate. In a way, it's kind of happening in tandem with the increasing disclosure requirements, which will be coming down our way very soon for our impacts on nature, and those need to be extending out, far into our supply chain in order to be effective. And those two things, it's kind of like you've got the knowledge raising awareness which disclosure provides, and then you have accountability, which is what a law like Ecocide would give. And when you think about the vast number of materials that we use in construction is coming from extractive industries and the ecological impact that those have, that's when that how rather than the what we do could potentially dramatically change. I think it also goes into our relationship with investors, and it also goes into this need for it to be international, because obviously our supply chain is so complex, it's so vast, and without an international scope and accountability, it would be harder to make that supply chain connectivity and impact incorporation to your business practices work, I think. Yeah. But I really think this is where the most dramatic impacts may be had, certainly within the business that I work.
I think that's a very interesting point, isn't it? And I think this is, for me, is what makes Ecocide feel really groundbreaking in a way that I feel like other environmental regulations have not. It is easy to understand. I think it's something that people inherently understand to be bad. It trips off the tongue in a way that people just get it. You know, when you say ecocide, you almost don't need to give a definition to the person in the street. I think they understand that it means killing nature, you know. And I think that means, I have certainly found in my work, that when you're working with particularly financial institutions and you're working with people, buyers, you know, big buyers, big investors, concepts like that are easy to grasp seem to get embedded and owned quite quickly within organizations, because it's not deeply technical. It's not something that people need to almost do a degree in. It's something that you can put into you know, briefing documents, you can put into employers' requirements in a way that says, you know, engaging in ecocidal activities. There is then an element of how that transfers down the supply chain and making sure we're educating people, you know, in advance of Ecocide law coming in that period that we were talking about earlier in the session, now to 2030. Now is our time to be alert to these things and start putting in place the sorts of practices that are going to prevent ecocide becoming a problem or a blocker in our supply chains in future. And so, practically speaking, Sam, how do you think, knowing that, you know, ecocide now has been referred to in the Environmental Crimes Directive in the EU, as Jojo told us earlier, you know, this is coming into force in different individual countries around the world. It's hopefully through the work of Rosie Boycott and all of her supporters, this will be coming into law in the UK. Knowing that that's the direction of travel now, practically speaking, what are the sorts of measures that you will be putting into place or you know, are starting to think about in your organisation and could recommend to others?
I think there's two sort of aspects to this. Fundamentally, a lot of what we do is about risk management. I'm not just talking about compliance, but obviously that's a major factor, but also long-term risk management for business viability and you know, the forward-looking horizon scanning for, if we want to still be here in 50 years' time, what do we need to be doing now? And going back to what we've just been talking about with supply chains, I think understanding how our business models, our client base possibly, or our project portfolio may be impacted, I think there is a big necessity in awareness of this Ecocide Act, if and when it does come to pass, for us to make sure that our risk models are fully cognizant of what that actually means across business. And I think the other side of it, there's kind of the risk and penalty side, but there's also the positive aspect as well. And as progressive businesses need to be looking to, okay, that's what happens if we do bad, or if there is bad, that's the consequence. But there's also the doing good, doing right, and all the opportunities that will come through, you know, striving for nature positivity and, you know, actually trying to be a force for change in the right direction rather than just trying to avoid negative impacts.
I love that. That's really good, isn't it? Because I think this I find for me as a sustainability professional that, and I'm trying to sort of unlearn it and teach myself a different way of communicating, but it is a constant battle because of the way that we've been sort of schooled and the way that the climate emergency has always been framed and the nature emergency. To talk not just about the penalties and the harms, but also to shine a light on the fact that what we're really trying to do is build a better world, you know, a world with clean air, with vibrant and thriving nature, with strong communities and strong and protected human rights, you know, and all of these things, which inherently is our birthright and, you know, we should be looking forward to, can often get clouded with conversation about all of the negativity and the dark. And I think there's a real cultural shift there that needs to happen, where we talk positively about what it is we're striving for and not just about the punishment. So, I mean, on that topic, and I'll come to you, Dougal, as the chair of the board of the largest environmental institution in the UK. How do you think that this is going to potentially empower sustainability professionals in their work?
Yeah, I've drawn, as I was listening to other speakers and thinking about this, I've been drawing up sort of opportunities and a threats sort of dichotomy here. And there's a huge number of things on the opportunities side for registered professionals. SOCEN registers, you know, practitioners, technicians, as well as chartered. And I think at all levels, there's going to be, there should be quite rightly a more call for expertise and knowledge and professionalism. Being able to, Sam mentioned risk, any environmental professional out there listening to this podcast will know that this webinar, that they're often asked to judge risk around the environmental aspects of what they do, which is, for an environmental professional within an institution and a team of people, is often, it can seem like a lone voice. It can seem like you might feel like you need to be more in step with the direction of the business, but this changes that language, I believe. I think it removes some tokenism that might be taking place within corporate decision making, where I've seen and I've experienced colleagues being put into positions that then report back to me as, yeah, it was great to get the job, but I'm not sure they're listening. Now, it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be the case of, something's got to be hugely dramatic and have Ecocide attached to it for those environmental professionals to make a difference. But if that's a way in, then we'll take it. I think more seriously and across the piece, the role of that expertise to be able to translate things for decision makers and leaders and those is really important. And I think it does link to where you were getting to with Sam around actually better decisions for the environment throughout, whether they're big or small, whether you're part of an organization that might potentially cause widespread and long-term damage, or I go back to the small cogs thing. Hopefully it will change that position for environmental professionals to be taken seriously. It puts pressure. If I might just go on to the reverse of that, is I think there's pressure on environmental professionals to get their head around this, to make sure that it's part of their language, that it's normalized. I used the word mainstreamed earlier. As chair of the board for the society, the reason I'm here, not saying no to you, because it's also a bit scary. No, this is mainstream stuff that every professional needs to get their head around, just like anything else that's on their desk that they may have seen as a normal part of what their job is to do as an environmentalist.
No, thank you so much. And I did, that we need to have conversations about this, about we are in a situation now globally where mass ecocide has been going on for a long time, as per the definition. It has to change. It has to change somehow. And I'm sure lots of people on the call who are also sustainability professionals will identify with that sense of helplessness that you've mentioned there, around going into an organization with great ambition to change, and yet being met with a lot of blockers that mean that you can't really do the sort of work that you want to. And it's my hope that this Ecocide movement will actually really empower sustainability professionals and give them the ability to back something, back a movement, back a cause, and talk publicly and advocate for an Ecocide law that will ultimately supercharge our efforts, that will make the harm of the environment a criminal offence. And I think, from the experience of having submitted board reports that end up getting bumped from one meeting to the next, it happens, it happens a lot. Potentially, when the directors are facing the risk of a criminal prosecution, it potentially then gets insurers involved and the risk managers and those sorts of people that our board directors are probably more likely to be listening to anyway, and potentially supercharges the work of the sustainability professional. So that's my hope. So I just wanted to talk about as well industries that may not see themselves as being potentially high impact. We in the UK have a huge services industry, a service sector, a huge financial sector. What are your reflections on what you think the obligations may be? And actually, I'm going to bring in now some of the other speakers as well, because I'd like to hear from Sam, actually, initially, if you could talk about money within corporates, and money speaks. You've got clients, you've got investors, you've got your board directors, maybe. I don't know Balfour Beatty's structure, but how do you feel like Ecocide will tie into the financial model of business? And then Jojo, maybe you could speak as well about the work you're doing with financial institutions potentially and what you're hearing back from them.
without wishing to repeat myself, I think it does come back to a large extent to risk, and risk in its broadest sense. So obviously there's the risk of criminal proceedings, but there's reputational risk, there's risk of being over-reliant on supply chains which are no longer going to be falling on the right side of compliance, and so therefore we need to adapt to it. I think it all ties in with the big picture sustainability. How do we as a business and as an industry actually endure? And I think in a way this is more of a policy than an economic point, but I think it helps remove nature as an externality. It may not bring it into a fully paid up model or factor within an economic model, but it does mean it can't be ignored in the way that perhaps economically and culturally it has been, in terms of these big decisions that large business and industry needs to make.
Okay. And Jojo, what work have you been doing? What sort of feedback have you been getting from financial institutions on how this may affect their work and how they assess funds and industries going forwards?
Yeah, I mean, it's still a relatively new conversation for us. We've been working with groups like, for example, Nature Finance and Business for Nature, and also beginnings. I mean, Sue could probably correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think we've had the beginnings of also conversations with the insurance industry as well, and the insurance sort of membership bodies and so on. And of course, we've also had conversations with the International Corporate Governance Network. And when they actually sent statements to COP27 and COP28 saying to governments that they should legislate for Ecocide. And of course, when they first started doing that, we were fascinated. We were like, well, what had your committee come out with that specific recommendation? And it actually, and in a way, I mean, Sam's already said it, but the key thing that came back was about risk, and was about effectively the sort of stabilization of risk and creation of certainty longer term in terms of where is it going to be safe to put our money. And so that was quite simple. But the other thing that came along with that was actually the real world concern of, we're actually seeing a very serious situation in terms of what's happening to the ecosystems that are ultimately supporting our businesses, and something fairly muscular needs to be done in response. So that was the other aspect. And then another aspect which came through from the nature finance conversation, actually, which was very interesting, was that there are some ways in which kind of the sort of higher levels of financing are not controlled enough, in the sense that if you're lending money, for example, the sort of know your client principle that sort of only operates to one layer. So effectively, so long as the person you're directly lending to is not doing something dodgy, then you're kind of okay. You're not having to actually examine further down the line. And of course, bringing the criminal element in would actually force that and create a greater pressure in that area, because effectively you can't be financing corruption, you can't be financing genocide, you can't be financing having to sort of look further down the line as to what your money's doing, I think will be hugely enhanced by having the criminal law parameter.
Thank you. I've got a question here about lobbying activity. So somebody asked the question to say, going back to a statement I made earlier, the statistic that 89% of corporate lobbying is to block climate and ecological progress in regulation. Maybe Sam, this is putting you a bit on the spot, but as the professional in the room, and maybe Dougal as well, you might have insights in this, but what responsibility do you think sustainability professionals have when it comes to the lobbying activities of their paymasters?
Wow. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure I could answer it on the spot, because I think I'd need to take it away and think about it for a little bit.
Sorry about that.
I mean,
Dougal, you're muted. Would you like to unmute?
But I would say that, I mean, what's crucial is that, and this doesn't just apply to Ecocide, this applies to every aspect of sustainability, and that is that the sustainability professionals need to be integrated in all of decision making across the business, because actually every component of business is affected by and affects on sustainability and Ecocide or any other component. And so just as work winning and procurement, you name it, IT, there is a sustainability component that needs to be part of that decision-making process. So too, lobbying and investment decisions and so forth.
I'm glad I was muted because I've had time to calm down a bit in answering that question, because I don't think it makes any difference whatsoever. I think any environmental professional should be putting across the needs of the environment, however small the decision, whether it's Ecocide or not. And if an environmental professional is part of lobbying for something that's going to cause environmental harm, then that calls into question their professionalism. And there are codes of ethics, there's codes of conduct that SOCEMV and all of the institutions that feed into SOCEMV make sure that their members comply by, their registrants comply by. So it shouldn't make any difference whatsoever. I think what's really good about it is it makes this Q&A happen, whether it's a webinar like this, or it's someone in their own head on a quiet afternoon with a gin and tonic in their hand, thinking about something they've got to do on Monday morning at work, or a paper they've received, or something they're editing. I think it does it's a really great way of just sharpening the mind around what it is you're on the planet to do as an environmentalist, and particularly, as chair of the board of the Society of Environment, when you're registered to a body where you're under the microscope for that professionalism. It shouldn't make any difference whatsoever. In fact, it should enhance the role. It should enhance your ability to have conversations, to challenge and to question and to make a difference in a positive way, rather than finding a way to support something that fundamentally might be damaging.
Hear, hear. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, conscious that we're running out of time, so I'd really like to hand over now for our call to action and follow up to Sue Miller, who is the head of global networks at Stop Ecocide International. Sue, would you like to rally us all and tell us what we can do after this webinar today?
Yes, thank you. And what an amazing discussion. And I hope what's landed for me, obviously, I'm familiar with it, but I think the points were emphasised that it's essential, it's happening, and people need to know about it. The diplomatic discussion, the political discussion is ahead of the civil society and the business discussion. And you guys, as sustainability professionals, are in the most wonderful position to help stimulate this discussion and get it going within the business community. Now, we've got a number of things that we could ask you to help us with on this. In the first place, talk about it to your colleagues, talk about it to your friends and family outside the business. But if you can, take it to your directors, to your C-suite. And if you want resources to help you to do that, we've got a website full of them. I've put into the chat, there's a link there to a business deck, which or a deck sort of geared towards business, which sort of explains about Ecocide through two different strands. One that says, that sounds like a great idea, tell me more about it. Or one says, oh, I'm not so sure about that. Why should I be sort of interested in Ecocide? So have a look at that, use it if it's useful. We've got an open letter, which is asking businesses to sign up to join our call for governments to support the creation of Ecocide Law. So please think about starting the process to get your businesses to sign up to that letter. The more voices we have behind it, the more powerful the cases that we're making. And another thing that we'd like to do is to sort of help get businesses starting to think about how an Ecocide Law could affect them, what they will need to do. And in many cases, it actually won't mean very much change or any change at all. But a useful tool would be a sort of set of questions that businesses can apply to themselves, to their businesses, to see whether they are Ecocide ready for when the law comes in. So I'd love to talk to anybody, anyone here that has ideas about that, and how we can put together this tool for businesses to assess whether they're Ecocide ready. If you've got any ideas or you want to engage in the conversation a bit more, then I've put my email address there as well, which is sue@stopecocide.earth. So just please, let's carry on talking. And if we can help in any way, if you think it would be useful for us to arrange a briefing, again, we can do that. And hopefully we can take this conversation further up the hierarchy of the businesses with your support. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sue. Thank you. So several calls to action there. And of course, everybody who is on this session today is working on this topic in various different ways. So please do reach out to any of us. You can connect with us through LinkedIn, or if you contact the organisers of the this Zoom, which is Stop Ecocide at Sue, then we'll be able to put you in touch with people and forward your comments and questions. We've had a really wonderful session. There are loads of questions that we didn't get to answer, and I'm sorry if I didn't call out your question. We have recorded this and it will be available to share with colleagues if you would like to. And yes, again, it's just left to me to say thank you so much. Thank you for your passion and your leadership, everybody who's on this call. Thank you for your support. And for everybody here today who's been listening in, please talk about this topic with your colleagues. Please talk about it in your communities. It's here, it's growing. There's one direction of travel, and we all really need to be on board and prepared. So thank you so much, everybody, for your engagement. Thank you for your leadership, and take care. Have a wonderful day.